Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the wood of the Holly, my television studio apartment, and across this digital divide, coming from one of the most important spaces in all of America, that's Grand Central Station, is a really incredible guest. I'm so happy to have him here. He not only lives at the pinnacle of academia. He is a professor at Clemson University, and he came to my attention recently with two very compelling op-eds, first in the Washington Post, and then a week later in the New York Times. He just finished a very intriguing book called What Iranians Want. He's written about the Cold War and the Middle East and culture and movies. He's here with me on the other side of this digital divide. A warm rebel without applause. Welcome to Arash Azizi. How are you?
How are you doing, Bill? It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So you just wrote this great book. I had the opportunity to read it. You know, when we talk about the Iranian Republic, you know, it's a pretty scary place from Western eyes, where I look at it today with all the oppression and what happened there very recently with the death of the young girl. But somehow your book feels oddly optimistic, What Iranians Want. And it's just a point of departure. I'd like you to expand on that.
Yeah, you know, Islamic Republic, it justifiably can be a scary place. It's a very repressive place. It's certainly one of the worst repressive places for women, if you think about it. But at the same time, of course, you know, Iran is my country. It's a country that I love. And I grew up in the Islamic Republic, and, you know, I faced a lot of those repressions, but I also have very fond memories of my people, of the society I grew up with, a very cultured society. We have a lot of love for the movies. In fact, I would say that, you know, never again, living in many different countries like the US, you know, Canada, Germany, other places, I rarely remember that culture, the milieu, if you will, as the one I sort of grew up with. Which was, you know, in the late 90s and early 2000s, young people in Iran were really interested in political change, but they were, you know, also watching all sorts of movies, reading all sorts of books, going to all sorts of theater. And it was sort of an exciting, it was a really exciting time. And I guess I'm not sure if the book sort of is optimistic necessarily. Definitely Iran is a dark place and a lot of, you know, reasons not to be that optimistic. But what I would say is that its attempt is to give life and show really something about the color, if you will, of this wide range of Iranians and their movements for change. The Iranian civil society, whether it's our environmental movement, the women's movement, the religious minorities who are fighting for their rights, and others. So in a way, is that what I'm trying to do with this book is that we all know how repressive Islamic Republic can be. We all know sort of all the problems there. But what I'm trying to do with this book is to sort of take the lens to the other side, to show, you know, why are these people fighting it? Why are they risking everything they have to fight this regime? You know, what are they actually doing? You know, really show the richness of their movements, right? So it's a book that I really wrote with all my heart about my compatriots and the kind of fights that they're having. So it's not necessarily optimistic because I'm not sure we will win, frankly, but I am sure the fight will continue. So it's, I guess, sort of a life affirming, if you will, and trying to highlight certainly people that I have a lot of respect for and that they're my heroes in this way. So yeah, that's what I would say the contrast is, the regime and the people who are fighting it.
Well, I would say that what Iranians want is not unlike what I want and what I cherish, which is my own freedom, whether it's my creative endeavors, just whatever, my freedom to protest. Those things to me are just fundamental. It's at least to the world that I embrace. And I was specifically intrigued by your narrative. Of course, the environmental movement, the labor movement, it's such a rich and deep culture. I don't think most Westerners really get it. They kind of, you know, they're a little bit geographically ignorant, you know, sitting there at the belly of South Asia on the Straits of Hormuz bordering Turkey. But it's such a rich and deep and poetic culture. So I appreciated your book for that because it shed light on that in a deep way. I was particularly taken by your account not only of the two young girls really, who were murdered, Masha and I think her name was Serena. I want to pronounce her last name, but
That's right. Yeah, Mahsa and Sarina. That's right. Amongst many others. I mean, that's
many
Mahsa
others.
Amini's death was a sparked the movement, and Sarina was one of the many people, one of the hundreds of people, including dozens of young women who were killed in the early weeks of the protest.
Right. They were unwitting martyrs in a way. And I couldn't help but think of Anne Frank, as you described Serena, whilst she didn't have a written diary. I guess her social media served the same purpose.
It's a very interesting comparison. I think it's an apt comparison in some ways. These were two young women who, didn't want to be heroes. They didn't want to be martyrs. Anne Frank wanted to be a writer, and she did actually end up becoming one of the best-known writers of the 20th century, effectively, because of the beautiful diaries that she wrote. And in case of Sarina, she didn't want to be a hero or a martyr or even political activist. Really, she was a young woman who was just trying to figure out life, and became a vlogger effectively. Only in the last few months of her life, though, interestingly enough. So all this sort of rich content that we have from her, most of it is from the last few months of her life. Some back to weeks even, I would say. I mean, just like a couple of months. And unfortunately, the Islamic Republic didn't let her live. They killed her in cold blood. So I know there are others, many young women. The reason Sarina caught my attention so much, and I dedicated a chapter to her. And I recently also wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal, based on that chapter. If anyone is interested, was that she had left more than and most others, so we could actually get a glimpse into her demands and what kind of a world did she want? Why would she risk her life? And when you do that, when you look at what kind of a world she wanted, when you look at the kind of daily obstacles that she left, the kind of complaints she had about the life of her people of her generation, you understand why she would risk her life on that path.
When you said in your book, ideologies don't make revolutions, ordinary people do.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case. I mean, it's people who make the revolutions. Now, leadership is very important. Ideas and ideologues are very important. Historians are really interested into why is it that ordinary people will risk their lives and participate and make the revolution happen. In his history of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, I think, at sort of some points talks about an ordinary person who sort of winks at an officer, and sort of sees the world historical change in this wink, showing a change of attitude, amongst the people towards sort of the goons of the Tsarist regime. And it's Trotsky also who says that a most indubitable feature of a revolution is eruption of masses onto history. So it's basically when ordinary revolutions are unusual time, because ordinary people who most of the time are sort of living around their lives decide to burst into the scene of history and sort of bring change themselves. And that's certainly one of the things we saw in 2022, as we've seen in other mass movements in Iran in the last couple of decades. So yeah, it is ordinary people, who come to make change like that.
As I look at the recent history of Iran, one of the metaphors that sort of leaps into my brain is that it's a volcano, and you see the volcano kind of bubble and spurt, but not fully erupt. And I'm curious, not that you have to be a fortune teller, what do you think might happen there in the next few years?
Well, as you said yourself, I don't have a crystal ball or a fortune teller. Iran is very notoriously hard to predict. But, what I can say is that Iran is going through a very tough period. It is not in a sustainable situation in many ways, because it's really suffering from incompetence of its leaders and of their failed policies. People keep coming out. They also haven't been able to bring down the government, mostly due to lack of organization and lack of leadership, partially helped by the infighting abroad, partially helped by the regime's repression of all sort of civil society and all organizing efforts inside Iran. Iran is some sort of is an impasse, really. It finds itself in a social and political impasse. Now, one of the events that are sure to happen in the next few years, and we don't have the crystal ball to know, is that the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader who's turning 85 next month, will die at some point. Now, his father lived to 90. The piece that you mentioned, Times, that I wrote, that I'm effectively sort of making a prediction there, that after him, even the current cast of Islamic Republic's leaders, who are all competing with each other to talk about how much they support the Islamic Republic and how much they support Khamenei, effectively they have realized that his policies have failed and they're likely to change them in the aftermath of his death. So that's one, the prediction I guess that I'll make is that the status quo in Iran is unsustainable and it won't last.
I live here in Tehrangeles, otherwise known as Los Angeles, and you can't get the hiccups here where I live and not be surrounded by 10 Iranian doctors and specialists. I had a kidney surgery. It was a Persian doctor, effectively saved my life. And so I can only imagine, well, I'm surrounded by all this Persian or Iranian talent, whether it's in medicine. I'm a stand-up comedian. Max Amini is a good friend of mine, and among others. And what a drain of brains, and yourself included, and talent from a country that needs that talent.
Of course. I mean, that's one of the things that makes the status quo untenable, is that because of the repressive policies, because of the international isolation, because of the economic ruin that this regime has overseen, a lot of people are leaving Iran. There's a brain drain. Even in the last couple of years, it's even worse. I mean, it's been like that for a couple of decades now. But in the last couple of years, it's even worse. Sometimes it feels like everybody who can is leaving. I used to have no family, for example, living abroad really. And now, I have family in Germany, in France, in Canada, in Georgia, the country next to Iran, not the US state. Why is that? It's because, in Dubai, in various countries, it's because people really see no future in Iran. I mean, that's if you're a young person, you feel like you have no future for growth. The national minimum wage, it's announced every New Year, every Iranian New Year, Nowruz, which is late March, and it just came out, and it's like less than $200 a month. This makes it, forget Western countries, it makes it about less than 1/3 of what is the minimum wage in dollars in Turkey, a neighboring country that, usually Iranians compare themselves to, because it's sort of, if you go since the 1950s to now, we sort of have similar trajectories in some ways. I mean, economically, and they're a country of roughly the same population, and roughly we have some historical similarities. And yet, you see now the minimum wage in Iran, I think by some counts, is lower than Iraq. Is of course much lower than most countries in the region now, the Arab countries in Turkey. So there is no future for Iranian youth, and then that's why they're leaving in large numbers. It's a huge crisis.
To what extent do you think is the West and the colonialism and the history of petroleum and British petroleum responsible? And of course, the coup that you and I discussed about Mossadegh in the early 1950s. To what extent is the United States or the West responsible for the events today?
I mean, the United States hasn't had a good role in Iranian history often. Sometimes it has had, sometimes not so much. Sometimes it has had a good role. But if you look at early 20th century, when Iran was really colonized by Russia and Great Britain, United States sometimes would have a positive role. But 1953, as you mentioned, United States helps Britain to overthrow the last democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, in order to effectively defend Britain's colonial interests in the Iranian oil. So that's a really tragic. It's the history of how Iranian democracy was overthrown, and it's part of the United States. Unfortunately, does that in many places during the Cold War. Earlier, actually, even in Syria in 1949, it sort of led a coup that really set the train of military politics, if you will, in Syria that hasn't been good for that country. And there are tons of other examples closer to home here, like in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973, Dominican Republic. So there are many sort of similar examples like that. And even in the more recent years, Donald Trump's exiting of the Iran deal, which he did in 2018, had a corrosive effect on Iran. The West-led sanctions are what has destroyed the Iranian economy. And they've been terrible policy because they haven't weakened the regime so much as they've weakened the Iranian society. The regime has survived. The sanctions have failed to dislodge it. But the people have become, socially weakened. How can you come out to protest when you don't have a job, when your wages are driven down? So it hasn't had a good effect. The sanctions haven't had a good effect. And Trump's leaving of the Iran deal, so this was a nuclear deal that under President Obama had been reached between Iran and a group of 6 powerful countries, including the United States. And Donald Trump scuttled the deal. He left the deal. And that itself had a sort of a really corrosive effect. It's ineffective. It strengthened and the most hardline elements in the Iranian regime. So it didn't have a salutary effect there. Yeah, so I would say United States definitely has there are periods like this that hasn't had a good role. Sometimes it also, as I said, has had a good role and good relations with Iran. But at the end of the day, Islamic Republic is also Iran's sort of own problem, if you will. It came out of the Iranian Revolution, after all, 1979. And if Iranians, like myself and others, want to overthrow it, we can't just complain about other countries like the United States and others. It's sort of incumbent upon us to get rid of it. And frankly, the situation has not been bad for the Iranian opposition movement, if you will, because the Islamic Republic has made an enemy out of many countries in the world, not just Western countries and sort of Israel, but also many Arab countries at many points have not been happy with it, which is why they've tried to help the Iranian opposition in one way or the other. They help fund these TV channels. They do this sort of support for Iranian civil society and all that. So it's incumbent upon us. We've failed to come together, present a political alternative, and bring down the Islamic Republic. So I would say that it's on us, really.
As I read the history, one of the things that hits me when you talk about the diplomacy of what they called in the 19th century the great game, and just because as a function of geography and resources, Iran has been, a central piece in this great game, whether it was with the Cold War or in previous dynasties. And just sort of to follow up on that thought, I'm just curious, what are the sort of goals of Iran? Maybe it even precedes the Islamic Republic in relation to their neighbors, because there was a time when, for example, Israel and Iran, under the Shah, had deep connections. There was a large Jewish population that thrived there that goes back to antiquity. And so there are other currents that flowed through this country that doesn't necessarily reflect the current moment. And that's just my observation. I'm curious to your thoughts.
First of all, let me start with saying that there still is a Jewish population in Iran. It's not as large as it once was, but it's also not, three people like Egypt or countries like that. It includes thousands of people, it includes a few thousand people. The real number is very hard to come by. I would say, the low estimates are maybe 5,000. The high estimates are 10, 20, 30. It's also part, and the brain drain that we spoke about, right? That sort of influences Jewish people in Iran also, they're part of it as well, right? And sort of disproportionately also because they're concentrated in big cities and Tehran particularly, and they're often educated. So they've been part of the brain drain, but also, just because they leave Iran doesn't mean they cease to become Iranian. So many of them live and have a strong Iranian identity, whether it's in LA or whether it's in Israel. There are Iranian Israelis or Iranian Americans who are Jewish, who are very strong identity. That's an important part of Iran's history, that Iran has long been. Iran is an ancient civilization, and as you know, it is always been a diverse place. Our majority faith in our country used to be Zoroastrianism before the advent of Islam in the 7th century. And today, yes, like on paper, 99% are Muslim. But that 1% includes Armenians, Mandeans, Zoroastrians, Jews. Armenians are Christian, of course, but then there are different kind of Christians like Assyrians, like Chaldeans, and there are new converts to Christianity. Inside Islam, there's a Sunni minority. There are other religions like Yarsan. There's the Baha'i faith, which is the most persecuted faith in Iran, and also its largest religious minority, with more than 300,000 people. So, Iran has been always an ethnically and religiously diverse people. That's because of the ancient and grand civilization, not just sort of a modern nation state. And as for what it wants in relationship to its neighborhood, of course, different governments and different states at different times have pursued different goals. But when we talk about an ancient civilization, like Iran, Iran, its culture, its main language, Persian, although it's not the only language by any means, they've always been central to the Near East and to this region. What Iranians want, as the title of my book says, in relation to foreign policy and regional relations, I think is for us to have good, amicable relationship with all of our neighbors, in the modern world. Iran also, I talked about the ancient civilization and all that, but Iran is also one of the only countries in world history, less than 5 or 6, that hasn't been colonized ever. So it has always kept its identity. And you think about it, that's remarkable, right? There are not that many countries. In fact, even the current sort of, the main basics of the Iranian sort of identity go back to hundreds of years. Its borders, even more or less, have been kept for the few hundred years. Yet, it changes here and there. So it has sort of a strong identity that goes back a long time. And also in modern times, Iran, it was a founding member of the League of Nations. It was, of course, then a founding member of the United Nations. Iran used to sit on the Council of the League of Nations. An Iranian diplomat, Entezam, was one of the first presidents of the General Assembly of the United Nations. There were Iranian diplomats who ran UN agencies. And an Iranian diplomat, Yan, ran one of the UN agencies in South Pacific. I believe that there was a trust territory somewhere there that was run by Iranians. So my point is that Iran has a sort of both an ancient and a modern, very sort of proud history as a country. What we want from it is for it to have good, amicable relationships, of good neighborliness with all of our neighbors and also with the world. Unfortunately, under the Islamic Republic, Iranian state often interferes in other countries. It funds militias, sort of follows policies like that. It threatens Israel with destruction. They are deaf to USA rallies every year, supported by the regime, but really not by the population. This is what we like to end. And that's why, one of my chapters in the book, it's about Iranians want peace, basically. They want peace on the basis of this grand and proud history that we have. And on that basis, we'd like to pursue a peaceful policy in our foreign relationship, in contradistinction to the current policies of the Islamic Republic that are not conducive to peace, unfortunately.
Which brings me to the current moment. Of course, we're in this sort of deadlock in Gaza. There's, in my view, a failure of leadership in the region. Clearly, with Israel and Netanyahu, and obviously on the other side. And, that seems like a flashpoint for the Iranian politics. Even though they don't share a border with any of these nations, they take a deep interest in what's going on there. I always found that kind of curious. Your thoughts?
Well, yes, the Middle East is in terrible conditions of war. Unfortunately, the Israeli government under Netanyahu is very short-sighted for its own interests. It had, after the terrible attacks on October 7th by Hamas, it had much sympathy, frankly, amongst the region, because it had just lost 1,200 people in this terrible onslaught, and it had hundreds of people being kept hostage and all that. But unfortunately, the terrible war that has followed in Gaza, it's committed numerous war crimes, and it has not reached its goal. It's killed tons of people. It's put Palestinians in serious humanitarian crisis. And humanitarian crisis is a euphemism. Effectively, not only has it killed thousands of Palestinians, lots of whom are children, lots of whom are women, but it's also effectively bringing, a policy that has led to starvation in Gaza. So, it has really followed a terrible policy there. And when you look at the region, first of all, let us remember that all Arab countries effectively came together in 2002 and offered Israel recognition. That's sort of Arab Peace Initiative. They offered Israel that it would only end the occupation of the Palestinian territory and solve its conflict with the Palestinians. They offered it recognition. And the offer still stands. The offer was given in 2002 by the Arab League. It was actually endorsed by the Organization of Islamic Countries, which includes 57 countries around the world and includes all the countries that currently, all the countries in the region that don't have a relationship with Israel. Unfortunately, it hasn't taken it, and now it openly opposes the Palestinian state. Effectively, it supports a policy that effectively has kept millions of Palestinians under military rule and conditions, apartheid-like conditions in the West Bank. So, frankly, the lack of leadership, it's often coming from Israel. Now, of course, I mentioned Arab countries. It's also the fact that there's only one country in the region that actually fights Israel head on and continues to threaten to destroy it. And as a result, of course, it's not contributing to peace. And that's unfortunately Iran. That's the Islamic Republic. And that follows this policy. So Iran, the Islamic Republic, has had a terrible role in the region. It has been one of the main reasons why we don't have peace in the region, frankly. I really think if you got rid of the Islamic Republic, you get peace between Israel and Palestinians much quicker. And I really and honestly believe that. It has had a terrible role. In the 1990s, it helped effectively support the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. The Islamic Republic has had a terrible role. But I have to also say, it also goes the other way. I wrote an article on October 7, actually, that came out in the Atlantic, where I said that yes, it's true that Iran, is behind all of these things and was behind Hamas. Hamas would have never been able to commit October 7th without years of support from the Islamic Republic. But it's also the case that the continuation of the conflict and the continuation of the occupation, the continuation of subjugation of Palestinians gives an opening to the Islamic Republic to go and play that role. So unfortunately, there is a sort of an unholy effective alliance between Netanyahu, Hamas, and Khamenei. This is an alliance of extremists, if you will. And what we need to counter that is an alliance of peace between Iranians, Arabs, and Israelis who want to live in peace and who want, and to do that, they need to get rid of leaders who don't follow peace-like policies. Iran, we are trying our best to do the same against Khamenei, who has much tougher means of repression in his hand, and it's thus harder to remove.
When I was a kid growing up in Los Angeles, nice Jewish boy, nothing seemed more hopeless and intractable than the struggle between Israel and their Egyptian enemies. It seemed absolutely impossible, almost inconceivable after...
Now you gave out how old you are.
Yeah, I know. I'm as old as I've ever been and as young as I'll ever be, as a caveat.
All right.
But nothing seemed more hopeless than the Israel. With the Palestinians, who are they? The Egyptians. And yet, a peace was found. They're still, in spite of all these traumas, they still,
No, that's right. That's right. That's a good example. Egypt was, a peace did come between Israel and Egypt in 1978 and 79. And, that's basically the end of Arab-Israeli conflict. When I teach this class, I usually teach it as the end of Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the shadow war between Israel and Iran continue, and sort of actually, in the latter case, it really starts in 79, or certainly sort of the 80s. But yeah, it's right. They, this enmity was able to come to an end. And it took brave men like Anwar Sadat, who gave his life, by the way. Right? He gave his life on this fight. He was assassinated 2 years later. And unfortunately, we don't necessarily have the same caliber of leaders today. And that's certainly what we need. We need someone, including in Israel, who would put their own nation's interests, right? You don't make peace because you like somebody else. You do it for your own, to end the conflict, to not have young Israelis going and getting killed in wars anymore. But unfortunately, Netanyahu is not that sort of leader, and for years he's followed the policy of that one writer calls cakeism, that having your cake and eating it too, as in continuing the occupation, but hoping that somehow he can also make peace with Arabs. And that's what they said basically very openly. Netanyahu and Eli Cohen, his former foreign minister, openly would say that no, we don't think we can have peace with Saudi Arabia without peace with the Palestinians. It was a preposterous idea always, and Saudis always said so if you only listen to them. But unfortunately, they chased this, unethical and unpragmatic dream, and it's sort of gotten us to where we are. So I certainly hope we see a change to that.
Even maybe arguably the greatest Zionist of all, Ben Gurion, the George Washington of Israel, he observed even at the founding of the state that Israel couldn't have the West Bank or all the territory, security, Jewish security, and become a democracy. You had to pick 2 out of 3. It was like a fundamental calculation. Thomas Friedman writes about it quite well in his book. And it doesn't seem any less true today. If you want to have the full territory of the river to the sea, okay, but you're not going to have a democracy. And so it's just an equation that seems
that's right. Yeah,
practical.
That's right. If you want a liberal democratic state, you cannot have it. And unfortunately, that's where we are now. But unfortunately, people are also just not informed about this. I hear people in the United States defend the settlements in the West Bank that are against international law and are against, any basic idea of human decency. This is a place in which, people who are born Jewish have all rights, and people who are born Palestinian have none of the rights. And this has been like that since decades, right? For entirety of most people's lives who live there. So it's a terrible situation. The good news is that it can come to an end. All it takes is the political will on the part of Palestinians, who have their own, there are reasons to blame their own decisions making as well, although nothing justifies them having to live under the occupation. No, but they haven't always done very well in terms of the kind of demands that they bring to negotiations or how they act at their negotiation tables. But at any rate, in the interest of the peoples of the region, we need people who would prioritize them, and that would really undercut Islamic Republic. Actually, if you solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Islamic Republic will lose one of its biggest excuses, one of its biggest claims for legitimacy, if you will.
And that was my question. If they figured out in Palestine, what would it do in Iran? Like, wait a minute, we've been hating these people for so long, and they figured it out. What do we do?
That's right. And we've been close there before. There are tons of Israelis and Palestinians who want a two-state solution, who want an end to the conflict. It's just a matter of, that's what the lacking of political leadership matters here. Because if you have leaders who rise up and sort of push this banner and try to understand, they'll find their constituents. But unfortunately, often what happens in politics is that people pander to the more basest emotions or fears of people, and instead of trying to appeal to the better angels of our nature and lead us toward better path.
The question I say is, as a Jewish person, are we a righteous people or a tribal people? Tribalism to me means my people right or wrong, and righteous means you're doing your best to be fair. It's not a perfect world.
If I may say, it's natural for any people, and especially people like Jewish people who have suffered as they have throughout history. It's natural for you to want to come to yourself and sort of support your own people, and there's nothing sort of wrong with that on its face. It's just a matter of, but then what does it do for your relationship to other people and your sense of righteousness, as you mentioned. I know tons of people who are very unhappy with where Israel is going, and these are people who dedicated their lives to Israel. People who are Israelis who dedicated their life, and many of them say we didn't sign up for this. We didn't want to, come to a place that occupies, another land and follows the kind of policies that Israel does in the West Bank. This is not what they wanted. And, for their sake and for that of everybody else in the region, I really hope that we are able to see peace and an end to the occupation there.
The state of Israel is a political miracle of the 20th century. When you consider the history, it's not going away. It earned its spot on earth through war and conflict and organization. But the Palestinian people aren't going away either. And when it rains on a Palestinian, the same raindrops hit an Israeli. So my message to both sides over there is figure it fucking out, okay? Let's get it done. It's not that hard.
Right.
It's put all this success of science, technology, on so many levels that Israel has accomplished, which is miraculous. It's put it at risk. And there's just as much human potential on the other side. So figure it fucking out, okay? I'm sick of it. That's my point of view.
There we go.
As an American.
Same here, yeah.
And I really enjoy this chat, Arash. As I read your articles, I said, I want to meet this guy. And it's one of the rare privileges of my obscure podcast is sometimes I get to do that. And I want to thank you for your insight and your scholarship and your advocacy, because there is a path forward. There are lodestars out there. I wrote a screenplay all about how young people got mentored in the discipline of Gandhi and basically transformed a country here in the United States. So I think there's hopeful paths forward. Maybe the current moment, in spite of how horrible it is, will open new opportunities for progress. That's all I know.
Let's hope for that. Thank you so much. It was lovely to be with you, Bill.
Folks, I want to first thank Arash Azizi for being here with me. I recommend you to read that book, What Iranians Want. It's not a long and difficult academic read. It actually offers a window beneath the surface of an incredibly rich country with deep cultural roots. It's a worthwhile read and it'll broaden your mind. So folks, till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha and happy Iranian New Year. See ya.